Have you ever felt like um, the modern financial and social systems are just uniquely, specifically rigged against you?
Oh man, yeah. I think a lot of people feel that right now.
Right. Like maybe you're driving to work right now or, listening to this on your commute. And you just think about your life. You work, you grind, you put in the grueling hours. But then, I mean, your purchasing power just vanishes into thin air.
Yeah, it's like the rules of the economic game just change overnight.
Exactly. And no matter how fast you run, the finish line just keeps getting pushed further and further away.
It's an incredibly pervasive feeling. It's this quiet frustration that millions of guys are experiencing, and it's exactly the nerve we're striking today.
Because today, we're doing an ultra long, really incisive deep dive into an explosive and frankly highly controversial new ebook that's making massive waves right now.
Yeah, it's definitely shaking things up.
It's called Money, Man, and Machines: The Story of Currency, Markets, and Society by Conrad Reicher. Now, before we unpack this, if this deep dive hooks you, we really encourage you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy Conrad Reicher's ebook.
Definitely.
And make sure to follow @Conrad Reicher at Substack. Also, just a quick reminder, make sure to like and subscribe to this show too.
Yeah, hit that subscribe button. And, we need to be incredibly clear right up front about what this book is and who it's actually written for.
Right, context is everything here.
It is, because Riker wrote this specifically as a tactical field manual.
Yeah.
It is aimed directly at men's rights activists and, red-pilled men in the manosphere.
Yeah, it's very targeted.
Very. His stated goal throughout the whole text is to decode the history of our modern institutions, like everything from the Federal Reserve all the way down to local family courts.
Which is a huge scope.
Massive. And he wants to look at how these systems operated historically before, as he explicitly argues, they were captured and fundamentally altered by feminists and Marxists.
Right. Which brings us to a really crucial point for you, the listener. It is vital that you understand our position here.
Yeah, we have to put the disclaimer out there.
We're impartially reporting on the contents of this book. We're absolutely not taking sides here. We're not endorsing Reicher's political or social or, his gender-based viewpoints.
Not at all.
Our mission on this deep dive is simply to unpack his arguments. We're going to lay out his historical claims, critically examine his logic so that you can just understand the exact ideas contained in this really highly debated source material.
Yeah, we're basically just looking at what he says and unpacking the mechanics of why he says it. The final judgment is entirely up to you.
Exactly. And it is a dense, really provocative text. I mean, it blends macroeconomics, evolutionary biology, and some very pointed social critique.
Oh, yeah. He pulls no punches. But to understand how modern institutions allegedly trap men today, Riker insists we can't just start by looking at today.
Right.
We first have to go way back. We have to understand what money used to mean at the very bedrock of human civilization.
And he starts with this central, really uncompromising thesis that just sets the tone for the entire book. He says, and I'm quoting here, "Currency is testosterone crystallized."
Yeah, that line really jumps out at you.
When I first read that, I had to stop and reread it. Like, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
But he's arguing that historically, value was never just something decreed by a government, right? Or printed on a piece of paper.
No, it required actual effort.
Right. Value required physical effort. It required raw survival instincts, actual physical skin in the game.
Exactly. He's really looking at the biological origins of trade, and he brings up these incredible historical examples of what he calls alpha money to illustrate this.
The Aztec one is wild.
The Aztecs, yeah.
Yeah.
So he talks about Aztec warriors. Before they went into battle, they would drink this incredibly bitter, highly caffeinated cocoa bean brew.
Right?
Riker calls it history's original pre-workout supplement, basically.
That's hilarious.
But the key here is that traders within the Aztec Empire actually used those raw cocoa beans as a form of cash.
So let's unpack the mechanics of that for a second. Like, why a cocoa bean? It's because growing and harvesting cocoa in that specific environment required immense agricultural labor.
Yeah, it wasn't easy.
You needed time, you had to defend against the elements, and expend human energy. So the bean itself was this physical manifestation of biological effort.
Precisely. And what's fascinating about how Riker uses this Aztec example is how he introduces the concept of central banking as this inherently destructive, almost parasitic force.
Right, because things were working fine at first.
Exactly. He points out that this organic cocoa bean economy functioned perfectly well on its own. The supply of money was naturally constrained by the physical limits of human labor and the seasonal harvests.
You couldn't just magically make more beans.
You couldn't. But then the Spanish conquistadors arrived.
And this is where Riker actually frames the Spanish conquistadors as history's first central bankers, which is just a wild analogy.
It is wild. But, I mean, he backs it up with the economic mechanics of what actually happened. The Spanish realized the Aztecs used these beans as currency, so they essentially started counterfeiting them.
Just faking the money.
Yeah. They flooded the local market with counterfeit beans. Like, they were sometimes even carving wood to look like beans, or just mass producing them without any of the underlying agricultural effort.
Wow.
And this triggered massive hyperinflation. Riker points out that this monetary manipulation devastated the local economy even faster than the diseases the Spanish brought over.
That's a crazy claim, but it makes sense economically.
Yeah, he uses this historical event to establish his first major pattern, which is that real money requires real effort. Fake money, or fiat money, destroys the civilization from within by diluting the value of past human labor.
Right, and he takes this concept of effort as money and walks us through history. He talks about the Roman legionaries.
Oh, assault, yeah.
Yeah. These were men marching thousands of miles, fighting brutal hand-to-hand combat. And they earned their salarium, which is literally the root of our modern word salary, in literal salt.
Because salt was survival.
Exactly. Salt was essential for preserving meat. It was literally life or death. But the example that really stood out to me, the one where he pushes this concept to the absolute extreme, is the Yap Islanders in the Pacific.
Oh, the rice stones. This is just a brilliant example of societal consensus.
Right. So these Yap Island men would risk their lives sailing hundreds of miles across shark-infested open ocean in these fragile outrigger canoes just to reach an island where they could quarry limestone.
Sounds terrifying.
It does. And they would carve these massive 4-ton limestone discs and then drag them back across the ocean to use as currency.
Yeah, 4 tons.
Now, Riker looks at this and compares the Yap Islanders' stone coins to early blockchain technology.
Which sounds crazy at first.
Right. I have to ask you to clarify this for the listener, because on the surface that sounds completely absurd. How exactly does he connect the physical, life-risking, muscle-tearing effort of moving a 4-ton rock to the digital scarcity of modern cryptocurrency?
It's a great question. To understand that connection, we have to look at the underlying mechanics of what gives anything value in a society. Riker's whole worldview here is built on Darwinian proof of work.
Okay.
For the Yap Islanders, that 4-ton limestone disc had value not because you could eat it or build a house with it. It had value because every single person in that tribe looked at that stone and knew the immense lethal effort that was required to procure it.
You couldn't just fake it.
Exactly. You couldn't just magically decree a new 4-ton stone into existence. You had to bleed for it. You had to risk death.
And crucially, they didn't even really move the stones around to trade them, did they?
No, they didn't. And that is where the blockchain analogy becomes mathematically and mechanically perfect. The stones were way too heavy to move for everyday transactions.
Right, you're not taking a 4-ton rock to the market for some fish.
Exactly. So they just left them in the center of the village. Or, amazingly, even at the bottom of the ocean if a canoe sank on the way back.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the tribe simply kept an oral, decentralized ledger of who owned which stone or which fraction of a stone.
Even if it was underwater?
Even if it was underwater. Because everyone agreed on the ledger, because everyone respected the initial proof of work it took to get it there.
So the mental ledger of the village is the blockchain.
Exactly. And Riker argues that Bitcoin's cryptographic proof of work is the modern digital equivalent of navigating those shark-infested waters.
That's a powerful image.
To mine a block of Bitcoin, a computer network must solve incredibly complex cryptographic puzzles. It requires massive, undeniable expenditures of electrical energy and computational grit. You just cannot fake it.
So it's tied to real-world energy.
Yes. Satoshi Nakamoto, in Riker's view, coded a system where value is enforced by unfeeling thermodynamics and mathematics. It's a system entirely immune to the whims of bureaucrats who want to just print value out of thin air.
Which brings us to Riker's absolute visceral disdain for fiat currency, right? Money that is declared legal tender by a government, but isn't actually backed by a physical commodity.
He hates it.
He really does. And he uses a metaphor here that is just tailored right to his audience. He basically compares fiat currency to a bad Tinder date.
That's so specific.
Right. You match with this currency, the profile looks great, it promises you all this purchasing power, so you swipe right. But by the time you actually go to cash it in for a house or groceries, the value has completely ghosted you. It's just an illusion.
And he traces the mechanics of this illusion, this inevitable collapse of fiat, all the way back to the Roman Empire.
Right, the denarius.
Yeah, he talks about emperors like Nero and Caesar. When the Roman Empire started, the denarius coin was roughly 90% pure silver. It had intrinsic value.
You could melt it down and it was still silver.
Exactly. But as the empire expanded, the emperors needed more money to fund their endless border wars and, as Riker vividly puts it, their legendary orgies.
Because you can't tax the population enough to pay for all of that without causing a literal revolt.
Right. People notice taxes, so you use a hidden tax, you recall the coins, melt them down, mix them with cheaper base metals like copper or lead, and then mint new coins.
It's sneaky.
Over centuries, they diluted that denarius from 90% silver down to just 5%.
So the government is essentially saying, trust us, this is still one denarius, even though everyone looking at it knows the physical value has been completely gutted.
Yeah, and the economic mechanism that always follows is inflation. The merchants aren't stupid. They realize the coins are mostly copper now, so they just start charging more coins for the exact same loaf of bread.
It's just a natural reaction.
By 300 AD, Riker notes, the Roman currency was so debased that citizens needed literal wheelbarrows and carts full of coins just to buy daily necessities. The monetary decay mirrored the societal decay perfectly.
And Riker draws a direct, unbroken historical line from Nero melting down the denarius right to the modern American banking system.
He goes straight for the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, he points to the year 1913. That is when Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act, creating a central bank for the United States. And Riker, ever the provocateur, makes a point to mention that Wilson was allegedly high on legally prescribed cocaine for indigestion at the exact moment he signed the act.
It's a very colorful detail. But Riker uses it to emphasize the absurdity of handing the nation's monetary sovereignty over to a centralized board of bankers.
Then he fast forwards to what he calls the fatal blow, which is August 1971. Richard Nixon goes on television and officially closes the gold window.
A huge moment in history.
Yeah. And for the listener who might not know the mechanics of that, what did Nixon actually do there?
So, before 1971, under the Bretton Woods system, the US dollar was theoretically backed by gold. Foreign governments could exchange their US dollars for physical American gold at a fixed rate.
Okay.
But the US was printing far more dollars than it actually had gold in the vaults. This was primarily to fund the Vietnam War and the Great Society domestic programs.
So they were basically writing bad checks.
Exactly. And when countries like France started demanding their physical gold back, Nixon realized the vault would run dry, so he temporarily suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold.
Which completely unmoored the US dollar from physical reality.
Yes. From that day forward, the dollar was backed by nothing but the full faith and credit of the US government. In Riker's biological and economic analysis, this was the exact moment the system gave birth to what he derisively calls simp bucks.
Simp bucks.
Yeah, a purely faith-based currency that immediately began destroying male purchasing power.
And Riker really brings the receipts on this. He asks the reader to look at their own wallet. He notes that real wages for men effectively flatlined right after 1971.
The charts on this are wild.
They are. Think about your grandfather's paycheck in 1965. A single man working a blue-collar manufacturing job could buy a house, a car, and support a whole family on one income.
Just one income.
Right. Today, that exact same physical effort, that same 40 hours of labor, can barely pay rent on a one-bedroom apartment. Riker states that $100 from your grandpa's 1965 paycheck now buys what roughly $16.17 would back then.
That's devastating.
The effort remained exactly the same, but the state siphoned off 85% of the stored value through inflation.
And his ultimate historical warning for where this inevitably leads is the Weimar Republic in Germany in 1923. This is the centerpiece of his argument that weak money breeds weak men.
Let's walk through the mechanics of Weimar because it's pretty terrifying.
It really is. So after World War I, Germany owed massive reparations in foreign currency and gold. To buy that foreign currency, the German central bank just started printing paper marks at an unprecedented velocity.
Just running the printers day and night.
Exactly. And the inflation became hyperinflation. The exchange rate of the German mark to the US dollar crashed from 4.2 marks per dollar all the way to 4.2 trillion marks per dollar.
4.2 trillion. I mean, the human brain can barely comprehend that level of devaluation.
Just numbers on a page at that point.
Yeah. Riker paints this terrifying picture of German men pushing wheelbarrows full of banded cash just to buy a single loaf of bread. He describes how workers would get paid twice a day and their wives would literally sprint to the bakery before the exchange rate changed at noon.
And ultimately, the paper became so worthless that men were burning 4 trillion mark notes in their fireplaces for warmth, because the physical paper and ink had more thermodynamic value as literal fuel than it did as a medium of exchange.
Meanwhile, who actually survived that? Riker points out that the people who held real power during this collapse were the ones holding tangible physical assets.
Nice.
The people holding American cigarettes, Swiss chocolate, or physical gold. Riker says this wasn't just an economic crisis, it was brutal, unfiltered Darwinism with a price tag attached.
The market doesn't care.
No, the market didn't care about feelings, it didn't care about the government's promises, and it certainly didn't care about fairness. It only cared about who possessed physical, tangible value when the music finally stopped playing.
If we connect this to the broader architecture of Riker's book, this raises an incredibly important causal question.
Okay, what's that?
Well, if sound money, what he calls crystallized testosterone, allowed men to build generational wealth, secure their lineage, and maintain independence from the state, what happens to the social contract when the state actively replaces that sound money with fiat?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Riker's answer is chilling. He argues that once the state removes a man's ability to store the value of his labor, the state must invent new systemic mechanisms to extract and control male labor directly.
And this transitions us from the high-level macroeconomics of central banks to something much more granular and personal and honestly aggressive.
Yeah, it gets very personal here.
This is where we enter section 2 of Riker's book. It's the concept of debt serfdom and what he calls the marriage plantation.
So once you're forced off the gold standard, Riker argues, you're playing a rigged game. The system can't just rely on inflation forever. It starts targeting men individually through the weaponization of debt and the legal institution of marriage.
To explain how the state weaponizes debt, he points to the 2008 financial crash. This is his prime modern example.
Yeah, let's look at the mechanics of what happened there.
The U.S. government handed Wall Street banks a $700 billion bailout. Riker calls these golden parachutes for, quote, soy boys in suits.
He loves his buzzwords.
He does. But these were the bankers who created the toxic mortgage-backed securities that crashed the global economy. They got bailed out. But on the flip side, on Main Street, 5.3 million men were violently evicted from homes they'd spent years paying for. Riker calls this phenomenon subprime masculinity.
He argues that 2008 wasn't merely a market correction in subprime lending. It was a systemic, orchestrated liquidation of male assets. Yeah. He uses the poignant example of Detroit auto workers. These were men who worked physical, demanding jobs for decades, assuming their pensions were completely safe.
Because they were promised they were safe.
Right. But in the fallout of the crisis, their pensions were gutted, while the financial institutions that actually caused the crisis feasted on taxpayer-funded bailouts.
He connects this to the Greek concept of kreokratia, or debtocracy. It's rule by creditors. And the insidious part, Riker says, is that this system is enforced on men who've been psychologically gaslit into blaming themselves for systemic mathematical failures.
Yeah, it's a huge psychological burden.
The man who lost his house in 2008 thinks he failed as a provider, when in reality, Riker argues, the currency and lending systems were designed from the start to eventually strip him of his equity.
And to show how deeply entrenched this idea of debt extraction is, Riker pushes the concept all the way back to the Bronze Age. He brings up the Code of Hammurabi from ancient Babylon, around 1754 BCE.
Now, under Hammurabi, the laws were notoriously brutal.
Very brutal.
If you defaulted on a debt, you could legally become a debt slave to your creditor. Or you could even be forced to give your wife or children as collateral to work off the debt. It just sounds like a barbaric nightmare.
It does.
But Riker uses this to make a shocking comparison. He points out that under the Code of Hammurabi, there was a strict, legally enforced 3-year limit on debt slavery.
Wait, really? Just 3 years?
Yeah. Once you worked for 3 years, the debt was completely forgiven and you were a free man again.
And Riker compares that ancient Babylonian limit to modern Western family courts, which he claims issue lifetime indentured servitude via alimony.
I have to push back hard here, because comparing divorce laws to literal Bronze Age slavery is a massive, incredibly provocative leap.
It's definitely meant to shock you.
Is he seriously arguing that modern family courts are worse than being an actual debt slave in Babylon?
Well, according to his specific economic logic, yes, he is. Let's unpack how he justifies that claim, because he explicitly calls the modern family court system the marriage plantation. He views it as a state-run debtor's prison that functions essentially as a protection racket. If a man in ancient Babylon missed a payment, he worked it off. But if a modern man misses a court-ordered alimony or child support payment today, he isn't just given a penalty fee, he is hit with contempt of court charges and physically thrown in a concrete jail cell.
And he pulls data to back this up. He points out that 12 million American men are forced to borrow money at predatory rates. We're talking 391% APR at strip mall payday lenders just to make their child support payments so they can avoid going to jail.
Riker actually calculates what he calls the marriage plantation index. He argues that a medieval serf working under a feudal lord only had to give up roughly 3 days of labor a week to the lord, keeping the rest for himself.
Okay.
But a modern divorced man. Riker claims he works 5 days for the state in taxes, 2 for his kids in support, and is left with -1 for himself.
It is a deeply stark framing. And he brings up statistics that are hard to ignore. He claims that 22% of post-divorce male income completely vanishes into alimony payments.
That's a massive chunk of income.
He also points out that 70% of the residents in homeless shelters are men. And Riker vehemently argues that the leading cause of male homelessness isn't drug addiction or laziness, as society often assumes, but devastating divorce settlements that legally treat fathers like, in his words, ATMs with legs.
He uses these emotional, anecdotal case studies to hammer the point home, too. He talks about a guy named John, a 42-year-old master electrician.
Oh, I remember the part.
Yeah, John worked 60-hour weeks, built up $300,000 in assets, and after a no-fault divorce, he lost almost everything. Now, John showers at a local truck stop because he lives out of his van, while his ex-wife lives in the house and drives a Tesla that he effectively paid for and continues to fund through alimony.
Riker notes that in states like California, the so-called 50-50 community property rule is basically a myth. Right? He says it's actually a 50-30-20 rule. Half your accumulated assets are gone immediately, 30% of your future income is garnished for the next decade, and you face 20 years of essentially indentured servitude.
Yeah.
He calls this entire process government-sanctioned cuckoldry.
So, the logical question for the reader here is, if the Western system of credit and marriage is a trap designed to liquidate male productivity, what is the alternative? How does a society function without these mechanisms?
And Riker's answer is really fascinating because he looks entirely outside the Western world. He points his readers toward the principles of Islamic finance.
It's a very calculated pivot for him. Riker contrasts the predatory nature of Western credit, where you have institutions like Goldman Sachs pushing 24% APR credit cards on gig workers and DoorDash drivers under this benevolent guise of financial inclusion, with the strict Islamic prohibition on riba, which is the charging of interest.
Let's explain the mechanics of how that works in practice. If you can't charge interest, how do you buy a house? Riker highlights the real estate market in Dubai, specifically the use of murabba mortgages.
Right. In a standard Western mortgage, the bank loans you money at compound interest. If you default, they take the house and ruin your FICO score. You shoulder all the risk.
The bank always wins.
Exactly. But in a murabbaha transaction, the bank actually buys the property outright. They then sell it back to the buyer at an agreed-upon markup, which is paid in installments.
So it's fixed.
Yes, it is a profit-sharing model rather than a compound interest trap. Riker respects this because it aligns risk between the institution and the individual. It allows men to build equity without being chained to the compounding mathematical warfare of a FICO score.
But the more controversial comparison he makes is regarding marriage. He praises the Islamic Mar system as a superior alternative to Western family courts. Now, for you, the listener, the Mar is essentially a negotiated upfront bridal gift, usually cash or gold, that the groom pays directly to the bride at the time of marriage.
And here's the mechanical difference Riker loves about this. Under this traditional framework, if the marriage ends, she keeps the Mar and walks away.
And that's it.
That is the end of the financial entanglement. There is no looming threat of post-divorce alimony. There is no endless discovery process where lawyers are billing $950 an hour to argue over who gets the couch and the Beanie Babies. There are no lifelong shakedowns.
I can see why his audience would find that appealing. But wait, isn't that essentially just treating a relationship like a pure financial transaction?
Riker would argue that marriage is a financial transaction, but the West just lies about it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He sees the Mar as a cold, mathematically honest system. It provides upfront clarity and respects male risk. You know exactly what it costs to enter, and you know exactly what it costs if it dissolves. He completely despises Western no-fault divorce, viewing it not as a progressive triumph of gender equality, but as a predatory mechanism that allows the state to legally liquidate a man's productivity on a whim.
He writes that a marriage license in the West is essentially a state-issued fishing permit for your wallet.
A fishing permit.
Yeah. And he warns his readers that any man who signs a marriage contract today without an ironclad prenuptial agreement is willingly walking into a slaughterhouse. And even then, he notes that judges frequently throw out prenups for arbitrary reasons, like emotional distress.
Which brings us to the next logical phase of Riker's argument. If marriage is a rigged casino and the traditional credit system is a trap, men are going to opt out. And they are opting out in record numbers. But human biology still demands connection. So where do these men actually go?
They retreat into the digital sphere, they jump into the modern digital dating economy. And this is where we enter section 3 of the book. Riker argues that this digital alternative is not a safe haven at all. It is just another, arguably more insidious and psychologically damaging mechanism to drain male wealth.
He calls this new paradigm the simp economy.
Right, the simp economy.
Yeah.
And he links it directly to a concept he aggressively defines as toxic femininity.
This is a massive foundational pillar of Riker's overall thesis. To understand the simp economy, we first have to understand his view on how society values the sexes. Riker argues that from an evolutionary standpoint, human society inherently prioritizes female credibility and female safety over male survival.
Okay, why is that?
Because for a tribe to repopulate and remain stable, women are the biological bottleneck. Men, from a purely evolutionary numbers game, are biologically disposable.
And he claims this biological bias has been hard-coded into our modern legal system. He uses high-profile celebrity cases to illustrate what he sees as a devastating legal double standard. He points heavily to the 2016 Johnny Depp and Amber Heard saga.
It's the perfect case study for his argument. Riker points out the mechanics of what happened there. Depp lost his marquee acting roles, his reputation imploded, and he was financially gutted to the tune of tens of millions of dollars, all based initially on allegations and a restraining order.
Right, before anything was even proven.
Exactly. Meanwhile, his accuser maintained her public standing, kept her acting roles, and became an ambassador for domestic violence awareness, despite evidence later emerging that challenged the whole narrative.
Riker brings more receipts on this double standard, too. He points out a chilling statistic in the UK. Only about 3% of women who make provably false accusations face any sort of legal consequences for perjury or wasting police time.
3%, that's staggeringly low.
He brings up the 2006 Duke lacrosse case where lives were ruined by a fabricated story. He details the 2014 Rolling Stone Jackie hoax, where a college fraternity faced a $1.65 million lawsuit and massive public destruction over a story that was completely invented, while the accuser faced zero legal repercussions. Riker frames this as society treating male reputations and male lives like disposable landfill.
So follow the logic here. If a man realizes that a real-world relationship carries the legal risk of financial ruin via the family courts, or reputational destruction via false allegations, what does his brain do?
It looks for a safer option.
Right. It seeks a safer, consequence-free alternative. And Riker connects this legal vulnerability directly to the explosive economic growth of the digital intimacy market.
Specifically, he takes aim at OnlyFans. Now, for the listener who isn't familiar with the economics of it, OnlyFans is a massive platform where creators, predominantly women, charge monthly subscription fees for access to photos, videos, and direct messaging.
It's huge.
Riker notes it is a $3 billion industry, but the statistics he pulls regarding how that money moves are absolutely brutal.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the Pareto distribution. Riker highlights that the top 1% of female creators on the platform vacuum up roughly 93% of the total revenue.
That's insane.
And where is that revenue coming from? It is being siphoned directly from the disposable income of millions of isolated men.
Riker includes this anecdote in the book that is totally absurd, incredibly sad, and apparently completely true. He talks about a guy known in Twitch streaming circles as the crypto cuck.
A prime example of what Riker terms beta buxing.
Right. Let's look at the mechanics of this guy's decision making. This individual had early investments in Bitcoin. He had amassed roughly $250,000 in hard cryptographic assets.
So he was doing well.
He was. But he was so starved for validation that he slowly liquidated his entire Bitcoin portfolio $250,000, just to donate it to a cam girl in a parasocial relationship.
Oh, man.
He paid for her rent, her vacations, just so she would occasionally read his screen name on a live stream and call him king.
And the tragic punchline of the story is that once he ran out of Bitcoin, she just blocked his account. Now, according to Riker, this former crypto millionaire is living in a 2002 Honda Odyssey minivan.
But I have to push back here on behalf of basic economics. Because Riker hates regulation, right? He loves the free market.
He does.
Isn't this just the free market functioning perfectly? A fool and his money are soon parted. Nobody put a gun to the crypto cuck's head and forced him to sell his Bitcoin.
That is a very fair critique, and Riker actually agrees with you that it is a free market at work, but he frames it as a deeply predatory iteration of free market Darwinism. He argues that this market is built entirely on exploiting a critical biological vulnerability in men. He calls it an evolutionary mismatch.
Let's explain the mechanics of that mismatch. How does that work in the brain?
Think about the Pleistocene era, when human brains were evolving. For hundreds of thousands of years, if a male received visual or auditory signals of sexual availability from a female, it meant he was in physical proximity to a real fertile mate.
Right.
His brain would release a massive surge of dopamine, rewarding him for successfully navigating the hierarchy and securing a chance to pass on his genes.
Okay, so the brain is hardwired to reward that interaction.
Exactly. But today, Riker argues, the male brain cannot distinguish between a real mate in the physical world and highly curated pixels on a smartphone screen. When a lonely, isolated man pays $9.99 a month and receives an automated mass-sent parasocial text that says, "Good morning, good boy," from an OnlyFans creator, his primitive brain releases that exact same dopamine hit. It mirrors the ancestral reward system.
So these guys are chasing chemical dopamine hits, but they're getting absolutely zero evolutionary or physical return on their massive financial investment.
Precisely. Riker says these men are trapped in a feedback loop, chasing digital validation like lab rats, furiously pressing a lever for cocaine until they starve to death. And he points to the severe psychological toll this takes. He cites a study indicating a 3 times higher depression rate among heavy OnlyFans users.
3 times higher.
The platform creates a vicious cycle, leading to what he calls the simp-to-incel pipeline. A man pays for intimacy, realizes it's hollow, depletes his resources, becomes resentful of his own biological urges, and falls deeper into isolation.
Riker summarizes it by saying, the West has successfully monetized male loneliness. It has turned male desperation into a multi-billion-dollar industrial complex where men literally fund the luxurious lifestyles of women who, in Riker's brutally blunt words, would cross the street to avoid them in real life.
And what is the macro result of all this? You have the family courts extracting wealth on one side and the digital parasocial grift extracting wealth on the other. The result, Riker observes, is a massive, unprecedented male exodus from the societal system entirely.
He points to Japan as the canary in the coal mine here. He notes that roughly 40% of Japanese men aged 18 to 34 now identify as herbivores.
Or Soshoku Kidanshi.
Right. And for you, the listener, this means these young men are looking at the grueling 80-hour corporate work weeks required to be a salaryman. They're looking at the expectations of marriage and providing, and they're simply saying no.
They're just opting out.
Completely. They're completely rejecting the corporate grind. They're rejecting marriage, and many are rejecting sex and relationships entirely. They live in small pods, play video games, and consume just enough to survive.
And in America, Riker notes the parallel movement MGTOW, or men going their own way. He claims there are 2.1 million American men quietly adopting this philosophy. They have looked at the actuarial math of modern society. They see the 1,000-to-1 odds stacked against them in family court and the dating market, and they are refusing to sit at the poker table.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Riker is mapping out a grand, quiet secession. He says, and I quote, "Let the Travthoughts bake their damn sourdough alone."
Wow.
He views this refusal to participate as the only rational, mathematically sound survival strategy left for a man who refuses to be treated as taxed livestock.
But here's where the narrative shifts from a social critique into a full-blown economic thriller. Riker warns his readers that the institutions, the central banks, the governments, the corporations are terrified of this male exodus.
They need them.
They rely on male labor and male taxes to keep the fiat Ponzi scheme afloat. As men start to wake up and pull their money and labor out of the system, the state realizes it is losing control. So they are actively planning an endgame.
And that brings us to section 4 of the book. Riker argues that the state's ultimate, final weapon to force men back onto the plantation is the implementation of programmable digital money, specifically CBDCs or central bank digital currencies.
This is a huge focus for him.
But before he dives into the mechanics of digital money, he takes a massive aggressive swing at what he calls woke capital and ESG scoring.
Right. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. It's a framework used by massive financial institutions to evaluate corporate behavior. But Riker views ESG not as a benevolent effort to save the planet, but as a coercive mechanism for institutional control that defies basic free market logic.
He specifically targets massive asset managers like BlackRock. He claims that BlackRock uses its trillions of dollars in voting power to force companies to adopt algorithms that dictate funding and hiring based on diversity, equity, and inclusion quotas, rather than actual profit margins or confidence.
He argues that ESG allows elites to bypass the democratic process. If you can't pass a law through Congress, you just use BlackRock to choke off the capital of any company that doesn't comply with the ideology. Riker sees the entire Green New Deal framework as a theology rather than economics.
He brings up two incredible examples of how this top-down planning fails when it hits reality. He points to Spain's catastrophic attempt at a green economy, which resulted in a $25 billion disaster where every green job created cost the economy 2.2 traditional jobs.
It just cannibalized itself.
And then he talks about Germany's absurd $5 million solar highway experiment.
Oh, yes. The Germans built a stretch of highway paved with solar panels. Riker notes that it looked great in a press release, but it completely cracked and shattered under the weight of standard snow plows after just 3 winters.
3 winters.
He uses this to show that central planners are completely disconnected from physical reality.
He says these central bankers are acting like medieval alchemists, trying to fund vegan yoga retreats and gender studies programs with freshly minted hyperinflated yen or simp bucks.
There's that term again.
But the ESG grift is just the warm-up. The real threat, the technological prison that keeps Riker up at night, is the CBDC. He refuses to even call them currency. He calls them compliance collars.
This is where his analysis of fiat currency reaches its terrifying logical conclusion. Let's break down the mechanics. If traditional fiat money allows the state to silently steal your wealth through inflation, a CBDC allows them to directly control exactly how, when, and if you are allowed to spend your money in real time.
Wait, I need to pause here for the listener, because a lot of people might be driving right now thinking, I already use Apple Pay, I already swipe a Visa card, my money's already digital. How is a central bank digital currency any different?
That is the most important distinction in this entire section. When you use Apple Pay or a debit card, you are using a commercial bank liability. You have an account at Chase or Bank of America, and they update their private ledger when you buy coffee.
Okay, so it's private.
Right. But a CBDC is a direct liability of the central bank. You would essentially have an account directly with the Federal Reserve. And more importantly, CBDCs are built on programmable smart contracts. The money itself contains code that dictates how it can be used.
And Riker points to real-world pilot programs to prove this isn't science fiction. It's already happening. He looks at China's digital yuan, which is already active.
Very active.
Every single transaction is tracked on a centralized ledger and tied directly into their social credit system. If you jaywalk or criticize the party online, the code in your wallet can automatically prevent you from buying a high-speed train ticket.
He also brings up Nigeria's naira. The Nigerian government programmed the naira so that agricultural or fuel subsidies could only be spent by eligible citizens on specific state-approved items.
Wow.
The money literally will not function if you try to use it for something the government hasn't whitelisted.
This raises an incredibly important question. Riker compares CBDCs to the old concept of company script. He uses the historical example of the coal mining days, where barons like Rockefeller wouldn't pay their workers in US dollars, they paid them in company store credit that could only be redeemed at the company store for company-priced goods.
Right.
Is Riker essentially saying the government wants to turn all of us into a closed-loop economy where we are just captive consumers?
That is exactly what he is arguing. If physical cash is eliminated from society in favor of a mandated CBDC, the state can execute what economists call targeted fiscal policy, but weaponized against the individual.
Think about how this connects back to the divorce courts we discussed earlier. Riker paints this dystopian picture with a programmable CBDC. An ex-wife's alimony wouldn't require a court order to garnish your wages. The smart contract on the blockchain would auto-debit the funds from your account the second your paycheck hits.
Instantly.
And if you somehow try to hide funds or miss a payment, a smart contract could instantly interface with the Internet of Things and lock the ignition of your car so you can't drive to work.
It is absolute frictionless control. Riker notes that the U.S. Federal Reserve's FedNow Instant Payment Pilot Program is laying the infrastructure for this. He predicts that by 2030, the IRS won't need to audit your tax returns. They will have an algorithm auditing your daily coffee budget in real time.
He says that if you are ever deemed a domestic extremist, and he notes that simply holding his views on gender ideology or traditional masculinity might soon qualify you for that label, the government won't need to send police to your door.
They won't even bother.
They will simply throttle your wallet. You won't be able to buy a plane ticket. You won't be able to buy a steak because you've exceeded your carbon limit for the week. You will be starved into compliance.
And Riker anticipates the counter-argument here. He notes that institutions like the European Central Bank claim that their future CBDCs will have offline, peer-to-peer wallets for privacy. Riker calls that a blatant myth designed to placate the masses.
He doesn't buy it for a second.
Not at all. He jokes that trying to buy a beer in Berlin during a centralized server outage will leave you thirstier than a vegan at a Texas steakhouse. The ultimate, unhidden goal of a CBDC, in his view, is to completely strip men of their fiscal autonomy. It is designed to punish any man who steps out of line, forcing the non-compliant betas to beg the state for rationed privileges.
Okay, so if you are a reader consuming this book, the picture Riker has painted by the end of Section 4 is unbelievably bleak.
It's terrible.
He has argued that sound money is dead and replaced by an inflationary Ponzi scheme. He has argued that marriage is a legal trap designed to enslave you. He has argued that the digital dating market is a parasocial grift hacking your brain chemistry. And finally, he has argued that the government is rapidly building a digital compliance collar to lock you into this matrix permanently. It sounds completely hopeless. But Riker doesn't end the book on despair.
No, he doesn't. And this is crucial to understanding the appeal of the book to his audience. Section 5 is his literal, actionable field manual for survival.
Right.
After diagnosing the disease, he prescribes the cure. How does a man actually reclaim his sovereignty in this hostile environment?
Riker's ultimate philosophy here is active resistance. He states that sovereignty isn't something that is politely given to you by a politician. It is something that must be aggressively seized.
You have to take it.
You do not ask the state for permission to be free. You engineer your own reality by moving your assets, your labor, and your life to places where the system's claws simply cannot reach.
And his very first rule of survival, the foundational step for reclaiming sovereignty, is learning to reject digital illusions. You have to learn the difference between fake scarcity and real scarcity.
Right, and he makes a massive, fascinating distinction between the fake scarcity of NFTs and the real thermodynamic scarcity of Bitcoin. He goes incredibly hard after the NFT craze, specifically mocking projects like the Bored Apes.
Let's look at the mechanics of why he hates NFTs so much.
He argues that an NFT is literally just right-click savable pixels on a screen. He calls it a modern incarnation of the 1600s Dutch tulip mania, but worse because it weaponizes male tribalism.
That's a really interesting point.
He talks about these young crypto bros who made a little money during the pandemic and immediately swapped it for status symbols. He tells the story of a guy swapping a highly coveted selfie NFT for a physical Honda Civic.
A selfie for a car.
Yeah. Riker looks at guys buying digital art just to signal on Twitter that they belong to an exclusive yacht club. He diagnoses this as testosterone-driven risk appetite colliding with pandemic-induced loneliness. It is men throwing wealth into a void just to feel like they belong to a tribe.
But he views Bitcoin entirely differently. To Riker, Bitcoin is the antithesis of the NFT grift. Bitcoin is cold, unfeeling mathematics.
Why? Let's explain the mechanics of Bitcoin scarcity for the listener.
So, when Satoshi Nakamoto created Bitcoin, he hard-coded a strict, unchangeable limit into the software. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins in existence. Ever.
Remember hard cap.
Exactly. No Federal Reserve chairman, no Goldman Sachs executive, no politician can ever hold a meeting and decide to print more Bitcoin to fund a war or bail out a bank. Riker views this mathematically enforced scarcity as the ultimate rejection of Keynesian economics and central planning. It is a return to sound money without needing a physical gold vault.
He absolutely loves what is happening in El Salvador. He points to President Nayib Bukele, who made El Salvador the first country to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender. When Bukele did this, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the ultimate symbol of Western central banking, freaked out. They warned him about macroeconomic risks and threatened his credit rating.
And Bukele's response is exactly what Riker considers alpha leadership.
Exactly. Bukele didn't back down. Instead, he mobilized state resources to build a massive Bitcoin mining hub at the base of a volcano, powering the mining rigs with raw geothermal energy.
Volcanic energy.
Riker says Bukele flipped off the IMF with every single megawatt of planetary energy he harnessed. That, to Riker, is the blueprint for sovereignty, using raw physics and uncensorable mathematics to bypass the global financial elite.
And while Riker advocates for Bitcoin as a store of value, he heavily advocates for alternative cryptocurrencies when it comes to technical privacy. He pushes his readers toward Monero.
For the listener, let's explain what makes Monero different from Bitcoin. Because if you buy a coffee with Bitcoin, that transaction is recorded on a public ledger. Anyone can trace it.
Exactly. Bitcoin is pseudonymous, but it is not perfectly private. Monero, on the other hand, is a privacy coin built on cryptographic technology called ring signatures.
How does that work?
When you send Monero, the protocol mathematically scrambles the sender, the receiver, and the amount so that it is completely untraceable. Riker notes that the IRS actually put out a bounty, spending $1.25 million on surveillance tools to try and crack Monero's cryptography.
And they failed. Riker says the crypto community just laughed because Monero transactions are as traceable as a fart in a hurricane.
That's classic Riker.
He notes that dark web markets rely entirely on Monero, and he frames it as the underground railroad of the digital age. If you want to hide your wealth from a CBDC audit or a family court discovery process, Monero is the tool.
But Riker doesn't solely trust the digital world. He knows that electricity can fail and EMPs exist, so he is a huge advocate for hoarding physical, tangible assets.
He actually advises his readers to go out and buy physical silver coins minted before 1965, often called junk silver, because they contain 90% actual silver and bury ammo cans full of them in their backyard.
Literally burying treasure.
He talks admiringly about Montana preppers. These are men who understand that when the digital grids fail and the fiat currency hyperinflates, the only real AAA assets are what he calls the 3 L's: land, lead, and livestock.
There's a brilliant, highly memorable quote he uses in this section. He recounts a conversation with an older mechanic he met at a desolate Nevada truck stop. The mechanic told him fiat currencies are just divorce papers signed by politicians. Gold's the only alimony that doesn't talk back.
That line perfectly encapsulates the entire ethos of the book.
It really does. And Riker makes a very careful distinction here for his audience. He warns them against gambling on volatile joke cryptocurrencies. He talks about guys using meme coins like Shiba Inu to anonymously tip online strippers.
Nice.
He says that is not sovereignty, that is degenerate gambling. True strategic sovereignty requires acquiring hard assets, whether that is cryptography like Bitcoin, privacy tech like Monero, or physical assets like land and gold that cannot be hacked, inflated, or legally censored.
And this leads us to the grand finale of his tactical manual, his vision of the great male secession. Riker looks at the booming van life movement, but he doesn't view van life as a quirky Instagram hipster trend. He views it as a literal escape hatch for men fleeing the plantation.
He describes case studies of highly educated men, former Goldman Sachs financial analysts, software engineers who are actively trading their six-figure cubicle jobs for a converted Ford Transit van.
Let's look at the mechanics of how these men are living. They rig the roof of the van with solar panels, they mount a Starlink satellite dish so they have high-speed, decentralized internet anywhere on Earth. They park on free Bureau of Land Management public land in the middle of the desert, and they just sit in their vans day trading crypto or doing freelance coding.
And economically, they are legally ghosting the system. Riker details how these men are utilizing geographic arbitrage. They register anonymous LLCs in states like South Dakota or Wyoming, or they set up complex asset protection trusts in Belize or the Cook Islands.
No.
They engineer their finances so that on paper, they own absolutely nothing. Their wealth is completely legally invisible to the IRS and untouchable by family court judges.
Riker's closing argument to the reader is that you have to treat fiat currency and participation in the traditional economy like it's last call at a bar. You need to use whatever paper money you have fast before someone better takes over the system.
Get out while you can.
You must relentlessly swap your decaying paper dollars for things of tangible, enduring value. Because history, from the fall of Rome to the hyperinflation of Weimar Germany, proves that when a system eventually collapses under the weight of its own debt and lies, brute pragmatism always beats bureaucratic groveling.
It is a sweeping, aggressive worldview.
We have covered a truly massive amount of ground today. Let's recap the journey of this deep dive for you, the listener. We started by impartially unpacking Riker's theories on the biological origins of hard, effort-driven, testosterone-backed money like Aztec cocoa beans and Yap Island stones.
Right.
We looked at his historical analysis of how fiat systems, from Roman coin debasement to the 1971 gold standard collapse, devastate civilizations. We walked through his incredibly controversial mechanism-driven views on how modern family courts function as Bronze Age debt traps, and how the OnlyFans economy hacks the male brain's evolutionary dopamine loops.
Yeah.
And finally, we explored his tactical field manual for escaping this system entirely through Bitcoin, privacy coins, physical silver, and off-grid van life.
It is a radical, unfiltered lens directly into the manosphere's worldview. Regardless of whether one agrees or disagrees with Riker's premises, the book challenges the reader to look critically at every single institution, from the local bank to the marriage altar to the smartphone in your pocket, as a potential mechanism of control. It posits the provocative idea that true, lasting freedom only belongs to those willing to ruthlessly engineer their own reality.
And that leaves us with a final lingering thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. Riker claims this great middle secession is not a future prediction. It is actively happening right now.
It's already started.
Millions of men are quietly adopting crypto, moving into vans, embracing MGPOW philosophies, and completely opting out of traditional marriage, corporate labor, and the tax system.
Yeah.
If you assume he is right, and this trend continues and accelerates what actually happens to the modern nation state when its primary base of taxable, compliant labor simply refuses to play the game anymore.
It is the ultimate economic and social stress test of a society. When the producers quietly walk away, the foundation of the state is forced to reckon with reality.
Something to really think about the next time you look at your paycheck. If you want to read this explosive field manual for yourself and dig into the mechanics we discussed today, remember to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy Money, Man, and Machines.
Highly recommend checking it out for yourself.
And don't forget to follow the author at Conrad Riker at Substack. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe button to support the show. Till next time, keep digging deeper.